Hi, this is Jim Critchlow. I'm going to talk about the theology in the book of Ezekiel. I've got several things that I want to say personally, but I also want to summarize the findings of Dr. Daniel Block of Wheaton. He has got a very good summary, a very good discussion of the theology of Ezekiel in the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis in Volume 4, pages 615 to 628. Now, before I get to Dr. Block, I want to just start with Ezekiel 1. This is Ezekiel 1, 1 to 3. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, end parent, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, the land of the Chaldeans by the Chebar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. When I was doing my exegesis and my dissertation at the University of Edinburgh, I spent 3 months on these 3 verses. I spent about 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 3 months. At the end of that time, though I had spent innumerable hours with this text, I felt I did not understand. Ezekiel is a complicated book. Ezekiel was a contemporary of Jeremiah, and he is the prophet of the Golah, the exile. Ezekiel was taken by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the hopes of the people of Jeremiah for independence, and he took Jehoiakim the king and the king's mother and his officials and everyone of importance from Jerusalem to the land of Babylon. The book of Ezekiel is dated not from the kings of Judah and Jerusalem, but from the date that Jehoiakim was taken captive into Babylon. That's one of the keys. The 30th year, verse 1:1, it's got many, many possibilities. I'm just going to leave it in tension. I don't know exactly what it is. But let me get to Dr. Block's comments in the New International Dictionary. Now, the key date is 597 BC, when the exiles were taken with King Jehoiakim into Babylon. Now, apparently, Ezekiel knew of the prophet Jeremiah, may have met him, known him, certainly knew of his writings. Many of the writings from Jeremiah ended up in Babylon. And so Ezekiel, the priest, would have had access to some of those, or he might have heard them at some point during his time. He certainly knew Jeremiah 24, the recitation of the good and bad figs. Surprisingly, those who were driven out of Jerusalem were called the good figs. The Golah was likened to good figs that were so good that they just brought pleasure to the eyes and the senses, and that God was going to treat those who were in exile as if they were good figs. On the other hand, those who stayed behind in Jerusalem with King Zedekiah, the puppet king appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, would be treated as bad figs, so bad they could not be eaten, so rotten they were good for nothing but being thrown out. Now, this is an unexpected announcement by Jeremiah, but Ezekiel, who is in Babylon, begins to talk about what does it mean to be a good fig, someone who is productive in the eyes of the Lord, someone who is appropriating the blessings of God while in a foreign land, without a king in power, without a temple, without a sacrifice, and without any of the blessings that have always been accrued to those who live in the land. Now, the way that Dr. Block breaks up Ezekiel, I think, is a fair way of looking at the text of Ezekiel. Part 1, the messages of doom, that's chapters 1 through 24. Part 2, the messages of hope and restoration for Judah and Israel, and that's chapters 25 to 48. So basically, the book breaks about in half. In the call of Ezekiel to his prophetic ministry, this is chapters 1 through 3, there is the superscription, which I read, Ezekiel 1, 1 to 3, the inaugural vision in chapter 1, the commission of Ezekiel, the preparation of Ezekiel, the case studies in chapter 3, and the initiation of the prophet in his prophetic ministry. Signs and visions of woe for Israel and Judah occupy chapters 4 through 11. Chapters 12 to 24 are some different judgment oracles against Israel. The Reeve, the prophetic announcement of misconduct against the Lord of the covenant, that is announced in those chapters 12 to 24. There are a couple of things that I want you to pay very close attention to. The excruciatingly painful chapter 16, which is the account of the adulterous wife. It is not a sexist statement. It is the way that God felt about the philandering and the adultery, the spiritual adultery of his people from Judah and Israel. Read all 63 verses and keep in mind that that is the backdrop for chapter 17, the eagle and the vine, the fable that the Lord tells. And then chapter 18, the disputing of the judgment of God. And then chapter 19, a lament for the Davidic dynasty. Now remember, God promised to David in 2 Samuel 7 an everlasting dynasty. That dynasty seemed to be in jeopardy with the exile of King Jehoiakim, and 11 years later, with the blinding, the killing of all Zedekiah's officials and his sons, then the blinding of Zedekiah and his parade into Babylon naked, and his death. This looked like the lights out for the Davidic dynasty. Now, as we continue reading in Ezekiel, you'll find very interesting chapter 23, Oholah and Oholibah, the two code names for Israel and Judah. Now, in chapters 25 through 48, these are the messages of hope and restoration. I'm going to skip down to the gospel of Ezekiel, and this particularly is in chapters 34 to the end of the book. Chapter 34, the salvation of the Lord's flock. Chapter 35 and 36, the salvation and restoration of God's land. 36, the restoration of God's honor. 37, the resurrection of God's people, which is certainly in line with Jeremiah 31. The renewal of the Lord's covenants with Israel in chapter 37. And 38 and 39, the guarantee of the Lord's protection over Israel. The last 8 chapters of the book is about the good news of the gospel, the return of God's glory to the temple, which will be established in Jerusalem at the end of time. Other comments that Dr. Block makes that I think are particularly appropriate. More than any other prophet, Ezekiel seems to be the prophet of the Spirit, the Ruach HaElohim, the Spirit of God. And Ezekiel embodies that Spirit in the power of his own ministry. He talks about the relationship of Israel with the Lord as an adoption by grace. Ezekiel 16 is one of the many painful chapters where the people have treated God's grace as something to be stamped upon, something to be done in. They take the favor of God and they adulterate. They push this off on false idols. In the breaking point of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel's wife dies, it's a painful chapter where God tells Ezekiel, do not mourn, do not go to the house of mourners, do not lift up your voice, simply your wife is going to die, the delight of your eyes. And of course, this represents what happens to God's people, Judah and Jerusalem, when they go into exile permanently. 586 BC, it was the end of life as the Israelites knew it. There is one additional thing in Nidadi 4 on page 627 and 628. There are additional supplemental readings. If you're going to do your exegetical task in Ezekiel, be sure to check that bibliography. Also helpful would be Dr. McConville's volume, Exploring the Old Testament on Ezekiel. Now, he's a bit broader than I am in my theology. I think he incorporates a little bit more of a critical view than I do. However, both Dr. Block and Professor McConville have great things to say about Ezekiel. I hope you enjoy the book.